Sorry, being recorded. Tom, thanks everybody. Good afternoon. I hope you're having a good day. Hope the term is going well. My name is Bob Digby. I'll be running this session. We'll be taking most of the 2 hours. We normally finish about 10 or 5 to 6, so we try and plan to do that. I'm in Cornwall, where, in spite of all you may ever have heard about Cornwall superfast broadband, it's a myth where I live. So I'm going to actually turn my video off. And actually, it can help something of the streaming process if you turn your videos off as well. If you could make sure that your microphone's on mute, there will be a chance where we'll have questions and perhaps sort of discussing some answers about levels of the piece of work you're going to look at this afternoon. So you can turn your microphones on then. But for the moment, if you could make sure your microphone is off and also turn the video link off as well, please, if you would. I'm going to turn my link off now. Thank you. Purpose of today's session, well, you can see it does what it says on the tin, really. It's about coursework marking training, and training isn't just for people who may be sort of feeling lacking in skill or anything like that, or maybe new to something. There are lots of people, I'm sure, attending this session who have been teaching for many, many years, perhaps as long as I've been moderating Pearson Edexcel work. But it always helps, because you do a task once a year, like you mark your A-level work. It never hurts to get a refresher on the purpose of this and what the marking is all about and things to look for. So I hope you find this session really useful. We're going to look in detail at one piece of work, and you'll get a chance to judge that piece of work. There'll be some reading time as well, so you won't be looking at it completely from new and trying to keep up with my dialogue about it. So we'll be looking at I was just wondering what happened there. That was all. Okay. So we'll be looking at this piece of work and trying to evaluate what it was that were its strengths and weaknesses and why it got the marks. Now, we're not going to use polls in the formal sense. Some of you have attended Pearson Edexcel training sessions before. You sometimes get polls on screen. We're not going to do it that way this afternoon. I'd just like to know, as your presenter really, what's your main concern about marking the NEA this year? Now, I've put 5 bullet points there that you might perhaps be concerned about. You might have your own concerns, but could you use the chat box just to give an idea of what your main concern is about marking the NEA this particular year? Is it the fact that perhaps it's your first time, or maybe you've had a couple of years away from A-level, or maybe some things about the mark scheme that you're not clear about and haven't been clear about before? So perhaps if you could, I'll drop down the chat box so I can see what sorts of things. So Catherine, I hope I've got your name you correctly pronounced. You said that you're new. Natasha, the mark scheme, I think that part of the purpose of this is to try and show you some of the markers that might pinpoint good performance and not. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Elizabeth, you've had your marks brought down. Again, that would be a good reason for being on a session like this. And Claire, you're saying you've had a couple of years gap. And Hina, you've changed spec, so you need to get your head around the different levels. It's funny because although they're looking at the same sorts of things, the different awarding bodies do things in slightly different ways. They're all heading in the same direction for the same standard, but nonetheless, getting your head is important. So thanks very much for that. I think that's really useful to start things off, and I'll try and give you a chance to sort of ask any questions or make any points as we go through. So we'll come back to these points as we go through. The title of the investigation, and there's a link in the chat box which hopefully you'll be able to download so that you can have a look at this piece of work. The title that we're going to be looking at this afternoon is Physical Geography, an investigation into the effect of coastal management on cliff profiles and beach characteristics at Monks Bay and Luckham Point. Now, I could just leave it there and say, all right, let's start looking at the work. I think, and I've moderated, I've often fed back to a lot of centres this kind of comment that when you get the title is actually by far the most important thing about the study. And one of the things that you are allowed to do as a teacher, without going into all the do's and don'ts of what you can't do as far as helping students is concerned, is you can help with the structure of the title. In fact, it is actually essential that you do help in getting the title absolutely right. Now, the reason I highlight this particular title is because as we go through this, we'll find that there are some ways in which the student does this title, deals with this title very well. And it really helps to define the data that the student collects, the way in which the student presents information, the analysis, and so on. But I think it's important here for us as teachers to look at, this being about the effect of coastal management. That's what we're looking at, on cliff profiles and beach characteristics. So what's coastal management actually doing to those two things? And the students chosen two locations on the Isle of Wight, Monks Bay and Luckham Point. So I think that's important because often I see, and lots of other moderators see, titles that may be just a straightforward title like this one, an investigation into. Some titles are in the form of hypotheses. They tend to work less well. They tend to demand answers that are yes, no. A lot of students, I'd say the vast majority, might phrase it a title like this to say, to what extent is the effect of coastal management on cliff profiles and beach characteristics, etc. They might have a kind of, or how far does coastal management affect cliff profiles and beach characteristics, that kind of thing. But this title is actually really nice anyway, just written as it is. Sometimes you get them, and I had a couple last summer. An investigation into regeneration in Stratford. Well, what about it? What is it you're actually looking at about regeneration? So I think it's important to have those conversations with our students that are allowable. And getting the title right really sets the piece of work off in the right direction, or the wrong direction if it doesn't come out right. And we'll look at a few characteristics of this title, which I think enable it to go down, certainly down the right path, even if it's not perfect. And bear in mind, we're not looking at perfect pieces of work. We're looking at pieces of work which actually tend to include the characteristics that are there from a very large number of candidates when moderators look at the work. So a holistic overview first of all. So there are marks for each of the 4 sections of the NEA. You can actually get the marks from anywhere within the NEA. So if, for instance, you find, we use the term literature review quite a bit to talk about the reading that students have done, background material. Some students call it setting the scene, which is a nice title about how the issue in which they're investigating has come about. You can sometimes find those bits in the analysis. You can sometimes find them in the conclusions. So don't feel that everything that is marked under the heading of introduction or aims and introduction has to be there. The marks for that section can be found anywhere from within the study, and that applies to any other section of the mark scheme as well. So the best practice that we strongly recommend is that you read through the whole investigation first before awarding marks for the sections. The first 2 or 3, and this always happens when moderators start every year, the first 2 or 3 take you forever. They really do take a long time because you're reading the mark scheme alongside the piece of work, and you're trying to get your head around the mark scheme, what it's about, and you're trying to get your head around the piece of work and what that's about, and matching the two together. It really does speed up considerably as you start going through, say, numbers 7, 8, 9, and so on. Of course, if you've only got 2 or 3 A-level candidates, it's going to take you, quite a while anyway. But careful reading of the conclusions and the evaluation often help to decide which level the first 2 sections may be placed. So sometimes, I'll give you an example. One of the studies that I mentioned, and the titles that I mentioned, an investigation into regeneration in Stratford. It wasn't a good title given to you like that, but what the student actually did as they went through, they redefined the title and they drilled down into what regeneration meant and which aspects of regeneration they most wanted to look at. And they didn't just take Stratford, they took a particular part of Stratford. So actually, it turned out into a really, really good piece of work. So you don't go with first impressions, is what I'm saying. Many elements of good conclusion, good critical evaluation, and good reading can often be found in the introduction and the methodology. So that's just a holistic overview. Read the whole thing, then start thinking about marks for the different sections. Okay, in your download box, you should be able to download the piece of work in the delegate download box. So there should be a link there. Perhaps, Tom, if you put a link for anybody who's not managed to get that into the chat box, please, that would be really helpful as well, in case there's anybody who's not been able to download that yet. And we're going to look at the purpose of the investigation, the first section, and that's pages 2 to 11 in your PDF file. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes to look at that introduction, pages 2 to 11. So have a scan through it and see what you think. And I'm going to leave this poll question here on the board about what level do you think the introduction is. Now, as well as the piece of work, you've also got in your delegate download folder the mark scheme as well. There should be, I think it's 7 sides in total. There's the summary one, which you have to fill in the marks and get the student and you to fill out the marks to say it's a valid piece of work and it's all the student's own work and so on. But the rest of the mark scheme is the detailed mark scheme for each of the 4 sections. So have a look through the introduction, pages 2 to 11, then see, using the mark scheme, what level you think that is. Now, the time is now 4:13, so I'll come back online at 4:18 and we'll talk through this first section so that you can get an idea of what direction we think this piece of work is heading. Okay, I'm going to go quiet now just for a moment. I'll come back online if there are any questions in chat to answer any of those, but otherwise expect to hear from you in 5 minutes' time. Well, hi everybody, it's 4:18. So if you've had a chance to look through the introduction, those page references, I wonder if you could just now put into the chat box what you think the level might be. Is it level 1 or level 2, level 3? What's your impression so far from what you've seen? So just the broad level, first of all. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Charlotte. Hina, Jack, thank you. Seems to be a fairly universal agreement around this. That's always good. That probably means we've chosen the piece of work correctly. So that's pretty well. Lisa, thank you. You've got a few more comments there to add to why you made that decision, what you thought, why you think it's very detailed. Right, thanks everybody. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. So the general observation seems to be, and the general judgment, that it's level 3, and that's what we're going to be looking through for this. So you can, if you said level 3, it means you've got that right. So what is it we're looking for? Well, one of the important things to look at in the introduction and in the mark scheme is the fact that at this stage of the investigation, you're looking at all 3 A-level assessment objectives. So you're looking at the extent to which there's accurate and relevant geographical knowledge and understanding. Note this of location. That often gets missed out. So relevant geographical knowledge, so knowledge about this topic itself, and understanding of location. So if the student is looking at a southeast facing aspect of the Isle of Wight, what is it about that location that's significant? What evidence is there of geographical theory as well? And comparative context. Geographical theory, don't get too bogged down in traditional 30, 40, 50 years old educational theory, geographical theory. If you start looking at regeneration in terms of Burgess and Hoyt and things like that, geographical theory involves things like theories of globalization, that kind of thing. If you're looking at a human study, or if you're looking at, longshore drift is a theory. It's been tested. It seems to work pretty well, but it's a theory. Comparative context. That's something that it means basically some sort of comparative study, and it doesn't mean a long case study piece of writing on the part of the student. What that means is this student might say, well, look, I'm looking at coastal management in this part of the Isle of Wight, but coastal management is a major issue along many stretches of coast. So they might do a brief description of, for instance, just a few miles away, you've got Christchurch Bay, or further north, you've got Holderness. Places where particular aspects of coastal management are really important, or they might talk about particular theories of coastal management and shoreline management plans, SMP. So means a variety of things. It doesn't mean great long details. It doesn't mean, for instance, 2,000 words on longshore drift copied out of their notes with all their diagrams. It doesn't mean a great lengthy study of Holderness. It means basically I'm looking at coastal management because it's a significant feature of what happens along many stretches of coastline in the UK and elsewhere in the world. And here are some reasons why it's done. It might be to protect, for instance, rapid erosion. It might be to defend particular beaches at seaside resorts. It's got different purposes in different places. So that kind of accurate and relevant geographical knowledge is important. So that's AO1. Importantly, they're applying their understanding for AO2 to find coherent and relevant links between this context, so between this stretch of southeast facing Isle of Wight and a broader geographical context. So what lessons might be learned by applying what's going on in the Isle of Wight to other areas of coast elsewhere and to longshore drift? What is it about longshore drift theory that seems to make it important as something that's worthy of study? So taking the geographical knowledge and, if you like, applying it in AO2. And then you've got the longest descriptor of the lot, investigating a wide range of relevant geographical sources. Now, you're going to say to me, I know, I can feel it happening because it happens every year. And I've had these questions in my mind in the past. How many sources do students need to find? That you do find some studies with bibliographies that run to 2-3 pages, and they don't need to do that. Often when you find a student who does that, you often try checking through the text and you can't really find much evidence in the text of what it is the student says they've been looking at. So I tend to find that the better ones tend to be, often they'll have a couple of articles from something like Geography Review, Geo Fact Sheet, Geofile, that kind of thing. They'll have a couple of professional reports, perhaps on coastal management from, say, it might be engineers or local authorities who've undertaken particular plans for that part of the Isle of Wight. It can mean a variety of things, but it means something. The key word in that first line is relevant geographical sources, to get geographical information and data that support the investigation. A lot of students use the endorsed textbooks, and you'll know that I've been involved in one of those. There are others, but when you see those textbooks coming back as the sole source of literature that the students consulted, I think they're missing out on a trick, and they need to be doing a proper search. That becomes particularly important if you've taken your students out and you've done a day, say, with 10 students about a stretch of coast, and they all want to do something on coastal management, or you've planned it that way. And they need to be able to show difference. They need to be able to show that they're not plagiarizing each other's work or anybody else's work. And so you need an opportunity to be able to offer them some assistance in looking for, researching particular relevant information that they can use. And the important thing in the second and third line there, geographical information and data that support the investigation. So information that's there and it's focused and it's relevant. Then the next thing, research information is used to construct an aim, question, or hypothesis. Sometimes students start off with my aim is, my title is, or here are my 3 sub-hypotheses. I often feel they've lost a little bit of a trick there. If they first start, rather as this student does, by giving the background information and saying, look, there's an issue here that goes on this coastline, and it's about coastal management, and the problem is this. And they tell you about the problem, they tell you the background to the problem, they tell you how it's emerged and so on. And then as they get towards the last quarter of their introduction, they say, and my 3 sub-questions or sub-hypotheses are these. I'm going to investigate this, and to help me investigate it, I'm going to break it down into 3 subsections. 3 is normal. Sometimes you find 2, 4 gets a bit unwieldy. 3 seems to characterize most decent pieces of work. It doesn't have to be 3. But I think you'll find that 3 works for a majority of students. So once they've done that, then they've given the information, then they come up with their main investigative title and then 3 sub-hypotheses or sub-questions that help them to use that phrase in the last couple of lines of the descriptor, a framework for investigation at a manageable scale. That's important, manageable scale. So when I said about regeneration in Stratford, population 120,000 or thereabouts, yeah, it's way, way too big. So get your students really drilling down into a small scale. And this one, the 2 locations that have been chosen in the title here seem to be very much typical of what looks like a good scale of study. Sometimes students then say, in order to do that, I'm going to carry out this kind of process. And they do that in the introduction. Some students save that until the methodology. It's fine either way. It's quite all right. So let's look in a little bit of detail then. So these are the things we want. We want demonstrating accurate and relevant geographical knowledge, location, theory, and comparative context. We want those things. We want to find that they've applied that to find coherent links, relevant links to the context and the broader geography of the area. And what we find is that when we look at this piece of work, the student demonstrates this on page 3. Many teachers, rather like the teacher who marked this piece of work, they indicate in the margin where they think that a particular AO is being achieved or whether they think a particular level has been achieved, and they sometimes box or underline whole sections of text where they see that particular quality has been achieved. Now, not only do we have good information for the introduction in the section that's marked introduction, but you've also got comments on longshore drift on page 15, mass movement page 17, and the impact of groins on page 42. So quite late in the study, you've got relevant geographical information. So that certainly meets level 3 there. Now, links to broader geographical context. You've got relevant geographical theory. Longshore drift is given plenty of explanation on page 7. And then you've got a broader context of the study where the student examines the role of global warming and climate change on coastal recession. That's done on page 4. And then you've got a comparative context on page 5 about Holderness. Now, when you start reading things, you sometimes have a yes, but I'd like to have seen something on kind of moment going on through your mind. And the principal moderator who put this training package and this example together feels that the investigation would have been better if there'd been more clearly annotated maps with scales. So for instance, the geology map of the Isle of Wight is just dumped there. Nothing said about it. Actually, with the reduced scale OS map of the Isle of Wight, which is scaled down very nicely, so much opportunity there to show things like dominant winds. You might show the dominant southwesterlies from which that stretch of coast looks fairly well sheltered. But if you know that stretch of coast, and you'll know, I'm sure, through case studies like Christchurch Bay and Holderness, sometimes it's when the wind switches that most damage is done. So southeasterly winds on that stretch of coast of the Isle of Wight cause more damage than the southwesterlies, from which it's relatively well sheltered. So that kind of acknowledgement, I think, can come through annotation. It can come through satellite images. You can look at the way in which on maps, for instance, the sediment drift seems to be going. Look up newspaper articles, that kind of thing, where do cliff collapses occur, that kind of thing. The study might have been improved if there was some sort of sense of the significance of this location. And we felt that this was something that the student hadn't quite done as well as they might have done. And similarly, the study could have been improved if the study of coastal defence options that were available to planners had been briefly considered. Not a huge amount of detail. It's not asking for another 1,000 words or anything like that. Sometimes just, for instance, even a spider diagram on what about shoreline management plans? What do they aim to do? How are these relevant? How might these have informed what the management options were for this stretch of coast? And then we have the AO3 criteria about investigating a wide range of relevant sources and the relevant information in order to come up with an aim or hypothesis and a framework for investigation. There really is reference to a wide range of sources here. So you've got coastal management on page 3. You've got hurricanes on climate change in 2022 on page 4. You've got another one on page 6, bibliography on page 46. Check that off. When you're marking, just have a look at the bibliography and make sure that you can see where the student got the information from. There ought to be a clear link between where the student's referring to and what they've put in the bibliography. And this research, once you've got that, it helps to link to the questions selected. In this case, it really does very well. The student does investigate the link in the first question between coastal management and cliff profile, beach morphology and sediment characteristics, and each of these is directly relevant and specific to the location. So the investigation of relevant sources is good. The research information is logically structured, it's comprehensive. The candidate comments on the questions and selects what they're hoping to find out. It looks at 2 adjacent sites, so it's manageable. It's not a huge stretch of the Isle of Wight coast trying to achieve too much. It all looks as though this scale of study and the research information the student has found, the questions that they devised look very appropriate. So where we ended up with this study was level 3, quite safely within level 3. The range of marks is 9 to 12. We thought that 10 marks was the best for this. A discussion of management options briefly might have helped the student to explain why the planners adopted the strategies that they did, and some further relevant annotated information to annotate the maps and photos could have been used to help get around this idea of understanding of location. So I don't know where you thought about that, and if anybody thinks slightly more than that, what the moderator is looking at, so that you know what happens when a moderator gets a piece of work. These days you download the pieces of work, and you download each one. You look at them individually. You also have a look at a few others just to get a sense of, are any that quite similar that you ought to perhaps look at together. How does it work that way? But we look to see, for instance, things like our sources properly referenced? Is the student genuinely referring to information that they found themselves? So have they got, for instance, Geography Review, volume 32, number 6, or something like that, whatever the reference is? And can you see clear reference to it? And is that student's work different from other students who might have looked at a different study, so that you can be reassured about plagiarism? That's the sort of thing that moderators do when they first open the file that's got your name on it on the student learner work assessment platform. Okay, field methodologies and data collection are next, and this time it's a 6-page section looking what teachers normally just call the methodology section, with good reason. And it's on pages 11 to 16. So again, I'll give you 5 minutes to look at that. And when you've looked at that and you've had a quick chance to look at the mark scheme as well, ask yourself the question, what level do you think that we're looking at here? Is it level 1, level 2, or level 3? Remember, those first 2 sections, they're marked with 3 levels, whereas sections 3 and 4 we'll be looking at later on in this session use 4 levels, but these only use 3. Okay, it's now 16:33. If I come back to you at 20 to 5, 16:40, then you can hopefully have a judgment by then. Okay, so I'll go mute at this point. Katrin, I hope I've got the pronunciation of your name right. Thank you for the question. I think it's a good question. Do you only need to make one comparative context to another place, and how much is needed? Sometimes people do go global, to acknowledge the final bit of your question. More generally, people tend to say this is important in the UK because, for instance, coastal management, shoreline management plans, for instance, tend to be a uniquely English and Welsh thing, adopted broadly by the Scottish government as well. One place is fine. It's to give the reader a kind of idea that the student has said, look, I'm going to look at this. I know that coastal management is important in this part of the Isle of Wight, but I want to try and explain why there's a broader context to this, why it's a bigger question, and how funding about coastal management tends to have lots of competition from other areas. And this is just one. I'm going to look at Christchurch Bay, or I'm going to look at Holderness, or whichever other stretch of coast you want to look at. So it doesn't need to be a lot of detail. Remember, the word budget technically for this section is probably only about 800 words roundabout, and the students well exceeded that already. Now, there's no penalty for exceeding the word limit, but we're not asking the student to take on yet more in trying to get and cover every eventuality in this introduction. So I hope 2 things. One, I've got your pronunciation of your name correct, and secondly, that answers the question that you've posed there in the chat. Hi, it's Bob again. We're not quite ready to start yet, but I thought I'd take Lisa's question. Good question, Lisa. Nice one. We usually advise students to put their methodology in a table. Do you have any thoughts on this? Ask any moderator whether they prefer a table or free text, and they'll all give you different replies. I think the important thing is this. I think if you want to see the best quality methodologies, they're normally done, I say normally, in free text. But there's a big but for this. If you fill out a table which has got grids, so say for instance you've got 3 key questions or hypotheses down the left-hand side, and then you decide which data you need to answer the question, I think straight away you're pinpointing the student into a more accurate way of thinking, because you're saying, I want to know what data you think are going to help you answer this sub-question. Because as you'll all know, we've all taught them, you get some students who think, well, I've got these key questions and I'm going to go out and I'm going to do questionnaires, I'm going to do environmental quality surveys, I'm going to do air quality surveys, I'll do traffic counts, etc., etc. And they just pebble dash lots and lots of different methods, but they never think about the information they need for each particular key sub-question. So a table helps that. Now, you don't have to have a table, because all you need to have is a checklist that you stick rigidly to if you're doing it in free text. So you start writing a paragraph and say, well, to get this, I want these forms of data, and you set out bullet points with reasons why you want them. The point I'm making is that if you have a methodology table that is, say, 3 rows high for the 3 sub-questions, and then sub-rows within them for the data that they need, and you've got things like data required, justification of the data, where data were collected, sampling introduced, and then evaluation of the effectiveness of the data. What you're guaranteeing is that certainly your medium and lower ability students have got that structural support, in the sense that if they see a blank cell in a table, they're probably going to fill it with something. If they were writing freehand text, they might well miss it out. And that's the danger with freehand text. But I have to say, the best methodologies that you ever see are generally those that students set out in free text. Often students don't like to fill out a cell with, they sometimes write mini essays inside the cells of the questionnaire table, and you find the questionnaire table goes on for about 11 or 12 pages, because you've got this one great long essay set within a single cell, trying to explain, why Guildford High Street on a wet Thursday in November was a bad time to do a piece of fieldwork, that kind of thing. So I think there are pluses and minuses, Lisa. I can't say I've any preferences. I don't have any preferences. Sometimes it comes down to whichever the student thinks, whatever the student thinks they ought to be doing. If you look at the RGS guide on the NEA, which is a really, really good publication, you'll see that they leave the door open for the student to make the decision. But again, they give you the option to look, here's what you'll gain, here's what you'll lose. Or these are the dangers, if you like, if you do a table, or these are the dangers if you do free text. So look, a long answer, Lisa. Hope it answered what you were hoping to get. Right, everybody, you've had a little bit longer to look at that if you weren't necessarily listening to that dialogue between me and Lisa. So if you'd like to put in the chat, what do you think? Level 1, 2, or 3? Any thoughts for this second section? Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Catherine. Oh, Catherine, you're being specific. Low level 3 again. Oh, I like this. Kelly, top level 2. Again, there's a high 2, low 3. Yeah, we're much more debating this one, aren't we? That's great. Thank you very much. That's given a really good flavour. Twos and threes. Kelly, missing frequency and timings. Yes, there are some things like that. You'll see a few little remarks about things like that in the principal moderator's comments about this. And Helen, common one. Thank you for raising it. Unclear sampling. Sampling, it's a difficult thing for students. Well, A, to really be able to distinguish clearly between sampling methods, and B, then apply them to the particular place that they're investigating. It's a tough one. So thank you for that. I'll close down the chat box and let's take a look and see what the verdict is. Well, the one we're looking at is level 3. That isn't to say that those of you who thought level 2 need to beat yourselves up. You don't. And you'll see why in a minute. Key things. Notice this time it's all AO3. So you're looking at predominantly, mainly a skills framework. So how is this, what skill is the student showing in demonstrating appropriate methods? That's the important one, appropriate methods, first bullet point. So appropriate methods, let me ask you whether or not in your own mind, you don't have to answer this in chat. So is a wave count, which the student said they're going to do, is a wave count an appropriate method? See, I'd argue that if you're on a stretch of coast, there's a colleague of mine, David Holmes, who many of you will know. Dave always says that coastlines are characterized by great long periods of boredom when virtually nothing happens, followed by infrequent but major bouts of terror. You know, when cliffs collapse or when beaches suddenly disappear, storm, whatever the latest name of the storm is, comes hurtling in. And that gives you your brief moments of terror. But for most of the time, things are going on. You're not there on the, or at least the student, we hope the students aren't going to be there during the brief moments of terror. And yet that's when most damage or most process is done. So is it worth doing wave counts? I don't know. The jury's out on that one. Some of you will be, I'm sure, very devoted to wave counts and giving students. I think they're great at Key Stage 3 and GCSE. Let's leave that one there. And I think that if you can get better information from secondary sources, that's the place to go. So for instance, I usually say to students, don't do traffic counts, use local authority data, for instance, about traffic counts that will have been collected over several weeks, and they'll be time framed as well. You'll see that how the traffic counts vary during particular times of the day and how they vary between days of the week and so on. You would never stand a hope in hell of getting that kind of level of data if you're an A-level student, collecting a whole range of other data as well. So why not go for the best quality data? So I think the word appropriate does need to be defined and discussed. And I would have that discussion with your students as a class. You clearly can't tell them, and you shouldn't even attempt to tell them, you know, which methods you favor. But I think you are entitled to point out to them, look, are the data that you're collecting the best way of getting those data, or are there secondary data which will give you much better? Because if there are secondary data, they'll give you much better. Go for it. So there's that. Second bullet point, a valid sampling framework. That's important, explicitly linked and applied to the geographical focus under investigation. That's really important. Third point, some of you have raised it already. This one doesn't do it so much. Frequency and timing of observations. Students sometimes cover that up. If they only did go to, well, I won't keep on using Guildford High Street all afternoon. If they do go to their chosen high street and spend, you find they've only done, you know, an hour and a half data collection in the whole of the time that they've been there. You're not going to get very far with either frequency or timing, but that will come out in other ways. Students need to be absolutely clear about when they collected the data and when, and how often, and why they set the frequency and timing in the way that they did. What was it they were after? And if they did end up with a Thursday afternoon on a wet day in Guildford High Street, then at least they can discuss the limitations and how things ought to be done better and how they resolve that by going to other sources. That's, I think, what you really want to see. So frequency and timing has got to be there as a statement of what they did and how they did it, but also the implications of that. I think that's what's in that word considers. That's not why it just says, it describes frequency and timing. It considers it. What's the impact? What's going on? Fourth one, research planning shows appropriate and relevant understanding of ethical dimensions of field research methods. That doesn't need to be a long essay, but it does need to take into account either environmental concerns, that good old phrase, take any photos, leave any footprints. It means anonymity of research sources unless people have given you permission to use their name or their job title, that kind of thing, all that sort of thing. You'll know what I mean. But the ethical dimensions of field research methods, they're well publicized. Again, the RGS IBG booklet on guidance for the NEA has lots of guidance about ethical dimensions, which students can refer to. Then the final bullet point, obtains reliable data. There's the key, reliable data and information as a result of consistently using methods with high levels of accuracy and precision. Now, in a dream world, we sometimes think as teachers that one day the GCSE students that haven't been affected by COVID and are able to go out and do field work and have thought about accurate methods and precise methods of data collection, and will therefore see the link between accuracy and reliability as a given. Here at A level, we're still hoping for depth of understanding there. You don't very often see it. That way, that sometimes comes up more in the evaluation. Don't hold students to ransom if you don't see a great deal on that in the first section on methodology. Wait until you've read the full evaluation, because sometimes little bits of that kind of thing, reliability and accuracy, leak out and appear where perhaps you least expect them. So give the student a chance on that one. It's a difficult section to do. A lot of students think that methodology is straightforward and descriptive. If you do it properly, it really isn't. It's analytical and it's applied. So they're the first three things you want: appropriate methods, valid sampling framework, and frequency and timings. The comments from the principal moderator are these: that the student collected a range of data. So you've got good information on cliff sketches and indications of height. You've got beach information, wave surveys. Well, say no more about that. Wave height and groin drop surveys. Groin drop surveys, there's different phrases for that in different books. So be careful that you clear, refer to what the student means when they say that. It's there quite clearly described on page 13. There's nothing wrong with what the student's done, just that different students use different phrases for it. And then sampling, discussed for each collection method, not just I did random sampling and that blanket covers the whole lot. Most students, the one that's almost never used is random, using random number generators. Most sampling tends to be either systematic or stratified, and that's not done terribly well, or opportunistic, i.e. you take the advantage of whoever's there or whatever's there on the day that you're there. But it does need to be thought about more clearly. Just to get our minds off physical geography for the moment, stratified sampling, if you know that you're in a village where 45% of the people are aged over 65, and it's split roughly 25% women, 20% men, then if the student at least makes some sort of attempt to reflect that in the people that they ask their questionnaire questions of, or if they know that half the village is modern estates and half the village is an old core, then environmental quality, they might say, I decided to do 5 environmental quality surveys in each of those different age bands of property. Just having some kind of idea about what stratified might mean. And of course, systematic in human geography doesn't work. They say, oh, I asked every 10th person. Well, once you're asking somebody, 10 more people might be going by, but you're not counting them. So I think students have really got to get to grips with these methods of sampling in order to make sure that they hit the top level. And then final bullet point, there is some discussion of how long the wave survey would have taken on page 13, but it could have been improved if there was a fuller discussion of how the time of year might have impacted upon the results. If they just said, I did a wave survey, but it was really just to give me an appreciation of how wave surveys work, rather than the impact that they might have had on coastlines, particularly during things like winter storms. And, I found a case study from the Environment Agency website on, etc. Just a brief reference to that kind of thing, and suddenly their wave count assumes a purpose, and often the results are put in as expressions of truth, which they're not. Final criteria in that level 3 band. Research planning shows appropriate and relevant understanding about ethical dimensions of fieldwork, and then the reliable and accuracy debate. And then comments there from the principal moderator, a clear statement about ethical considerations, though it's rather generic, but it's there nonetheless. There is a risk assessment. It's not a requirement. Most students, I would say, actually do put in a risk assessment. Don't stop them. I think it's a good thing for students to do to assess risk. You'll want it as a teacher, I'm quite sure, in case any parent comes back to you and says, "Look, are you sure this is a safe method?" And then that you can assure them, and you can assure the student that a particular method being proposed is something that's normally done, or something you wish to dissuade them from doing. Appropriate referencing of secondary data. Often students start introducing secondary data at an early stage, and they really did ought to mention secondary data more than many of them do. The data are thought to be accurate, as the groin drop survey would accurately measure the impact on longshore drift. That's a good way you can assess the students' data collection. And then you can be thought of as precise, as a clinometer was used to measure cliff height. So there are elements there which are all good. And again, those of you who thought that this was perhaps upper level 2, well, you weren't far away. It's one of those when the moderator looks at this, you think, I think this one's sitting on the boundary. It's what I call a bar wobbler, in using a high jump analogy. It's probably got elements of level 2 on 7 marks. Just about, we felt, it tipped into 8 marks, just about into level 3, for the reasons that you've seen. Okay, let me just take a look at the chat questions, see if there's anything there. Sean, good question. They're all good questions this afternoon. Is there a potential criticism here? Read lack of secondary generally. Yes, there is. Good secondary data used well are rarities, to be honest, Sean. And I think if students can use good quality secondary data, I think part of the problem is, I mean, let's imagine and say that they look at an environmental agency report on, say, coastal flooding. The level of detail in those reports is hard for a student to distill which particular elements, which particular data they want from a report. So I think they're often put off. I think they often have a bad experience in looking at very, very detailed reports. But Elizabeth, you're right. There is still a requirement to do primary data collection. That comes up as something we're going to discuss at the end. And I knew this one was going to come up, because it always does. How many techniques should students use to collect their own data? It's not a juggling contest. It's not a winning contest. I'm going to leave you frustratingly with the answer, whatever's appropriate. So as an example, if I wanted to look at beach profiling in order to look at the impact of longshore drift, I would clearly want things like beach angle. I clearly want sediment sizes, sediment sampling. So I want ranging poles. I'd want all the kind of equipment. I'd be thinking about all of that. And it may well be, if you're looking at a coastline, say, for instance, that adjoins somewhere like Studland or something, you'll be looking at dunes and dune formation. You want quadrats as well. You just have to do the job that's needed to be able to answer the question. And that's why I think students can sometimes look at secondary sources to get ideas of methods that other people have used. There's nothing wrong, for instance, with replicating a study done by somebody else that's been published. One of the exemplars that's been used by us in one of these sessions in past years is a study of quality of life in 2 particular suburbs of Newcastle. And it basically came from an evaluation of a piece of work. An urban researcher in 1989 published 10 things that led to a good quality suburb, or good quality of life for people living in cities. And the student went out and tested, I think it was 5 or 6 of those particular things that the researcher had come up with. So there's nothing wrong with sorry, I'll just pause there, looking at Catherine's question. It's another good one. I'll answer that in a sec. There's nothing wrong with replicating somebody else's work. There's nothing wrong with going to secondary data to say, look, the data that I got were pretty thin on the ground. So here are some secondary data to bulk up, to supplement what I was looking at. Now, Catherine, sample sizes, questionnaire questionnaires have always been the bane of individual study lives. And I say always, I go back to the 1980s running these things. So they were a bane then, they're a bane now. And they're a bane because I think to be done effectively, you've got to have a decent sample size. 30 or 50, some poor student battling on their own on a high street, it's risky. I think if you want to use a questionnaire, I would go out and use probably one of my AS days in year one, might be sending students out to do 10 questionnaires each as a pair and come back from the whole class, say with 100 questionnaires, collate them and then discuss sample sizes and why you need a good sample size, because that would encourage students to collaborate more in their data collection on particular questionnaires and sample sizes there. You do get, unfortunately, some hapless soul who's clearly standing by themselves in the middle of a village somewhere, and they find 5 people to interview. If they're going to do that, and if you think that's a risk, scrap the word questionnaire and turn it into a one-to-one interview as well, with longer, more open-ended questions, which the student can probe. You might need to do some practicing. Students are naturally, when they get into situations like that, naturally a little bit shy about talking to members of the public. And I think if you have a pair of students who have thought about what a good interview profile might be of about 5 questions that will keep the person standing there talking to them for about 5 or 6 minutes, that's probably what you want to aim for if numbers are a risk. If you're confident you can give students a decent sample size of a questionnaire, then as many as you can muster is good. 30 isn't as good as 50, and 50 is not as good as 70. But to give you some idea, if you just type in sample size generator into Google, there are lots of sample size software applications that will tell you, say, if you've got a population of 654 in a village, how many people do you need in that village? And it'll come up with something like, I don't know, I'm making this figure up, 42 or something like that. And it'll give you an idea, or give the student an idea of where to aim for and what might be an appropriate size. Interestingly, when you get to London and you type in the population about 9 million, it comes up with something like 650. So you could probably achieve that as well. If you're part of a sixth form college or something and you're listening to this and you've got 200 students, you might be able to manage that one. Anyway, there's a lot of discussion. So thanks for the questions, and I hope I've given you some reasonable answer. That one, I think you could sit that one firmly on the bar, if you like. Going back to the high jump analogy, the moderator would think, I'm sure, that level 2-7. Don't, by the way, please put down on the mark sheet 7/8. If you are in 2 minds about whether it's a level 2 or a level 3, you must go for one, because you can't have 2 7s and an 8 in different sections and say, well, I'll make that 15. The moderator will send it back to you for more definite questions. Hope that's clear. Anyway, part 3. Now you've got more to read this time, as you might expect. So pages 17 to 26. And this is, I think, the interesting bit of the study. And I won't say much more, except I think you'll find the mark scheme, the student really makes a good effort at having a go at the mark scheme. But there's a structural problem somewhere here in this section. And it would be good if you had a look at it to see if you can find out what it is. So it's 1700 now, 5 o'clock now. So let's give you till 5:10 to look at this, and then we'll come back and discuss where we think this student is going with the marks. So again, I'll go quiet and I'll answer during that time any chat questions that come up. You can always mute me if you find my ramblings are a little bit hard to listen to. Anthony, I think that's a really nice point. Some extenuating circumstances could limit the depth and numeracy of primary data used. That's true. Sometimes, if you get a rural school, there's some secondary schools in Cornwall with only about 200-300 students. Very small sixth form. You've got either that choice or Truro College, which has got, I think, something in the region of about 160, 180 students in a year. Both are challenging. So the depth and numeracy of primary data used can be a problem, and forces students, I think that's what you're saying, it forces students to look a little bit more at secondary. I don't think that's a bad thing. And I wish your point, your reference there to regenerating places, I wish students would use secondary sources when they study regeneration. They often go out and they do, 3 or 4 techniques, environmental quality, etc., and they draw some most implausible conclusions, which is a real shame. If they were to use some secondary sources, that might alleviate that risk. Thanks for the comment, Anthony. Okay, it's 9 minutes past. If you're perhaps happy with what you think this might be, if you'd like to put your level assessment into the chat box, we can see what people think. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Jack. Hina, Kelly, Claire, Jennifer, Jonathan, you're probably in agreement, aren't you? I think you've been phoning each other and saying, what are you going to put down? And Helen just says, agree. Yeah, exactly. Yes, Kelly. Interesting about the conclusions, almost double concludes. It's an interesting one. I've said, I don't know how you felt about this. I was looked at the beginning of this one when I first read this a few weeks ago, and I thought, why are there no annotations in the photographs? I was almost screaming at the student, for goodness sake, you've bothered to put a photo in with a figure number beside it or below it, and you don't go and you don't refer to it, you don't annotate it. Annotated photographs, moderators love annotated photographs. We really, really love annotated photographs that are linked to what the student is studying. 4 or 5, maybe 6, 7. Kelly says that's the first thing you've got on your notes. Yeah, jolly good. I knew we'd be thinking the same way. But those annotations, the good quality annotations, link back to the focus of the study. So if they're looking at one of their sub questions and they're using photographs as a source of evidence, pebble dash it with evidence, with really decent annotations, not just 2 words like, a tree or something like that, not that kind of thing. Short paragraphs, maybe something like 20, 30 words inside a text box that will point out a feature that the student is highlighting and what that feature shows in terms of relevance to the main focus of the study. Yeah, Catherine, it is a long study, isn't it? This one, we don't penalise. You do end up asking yourself, could they have done it in a shorter length? And the answer to this is probably yes. But you can't penalise, because sometimes, I say sometimes, quite a lot actually, you do see some labours of love. You really do. I don't want to go all sort of sweet and juicy on it or anything like that, but you really do see some that students have clearly thoroughly enjoyed doing it, and you don't want to penalise them. Anyway, let's have a look and see what we're looking at. We came to the conclusion that it was level 3. So there you are. Those of you who said level 3, the vast majority of you, you've got the indicators there. Again, it's all AO3. And what we're going to look at now is about skills in deconstructing data. And I don't know, it's a personal thing. I thought it was the student held off till the end in demonstrating their data presentation skills until the 3rd sub-question. But anyway, that's what they did. They deconstructed the data. Now, this is the next bit. That second line of the first bullet point, partially evidenced connections and mostly accurate statistical geographical significance of the data. That's the discriminator between level 3 and 4. Evidence connections and partially evidence connections, accurate statistical geographical significance and mostly accurate. So that hopefully will give you, the mark schemes are an exercise in really looking at a detailed breakdown. It's the same for all the boards. They're really detailed pieces of work, and I've worked with them long enough to know that they really do the job. But if you're first time around this, you might be looking at this and thinking, well, I don't see what the difference is between 3 and 4. I think it's good to get to know the differences between 3 and 4, because you'll spend quite a lot of your time sorting out students who are either level 3 or level 4. The level 1s and 2s, unfortunately, you might have some students among these yourselves, very often leave the course before they submit their work. So you're left with a disproportionate number of students where you're looking at level 3 and 4. So that's the first thing. Second thing, provides a generally balanced appraisal that may lack detail in some aspects of techniques. It's where you think the student's going the right way. I wish they'd given me a bit more on. it's that kind of reaction if you have that. And in particular, this one is looking at, this descriptor looks at ethical dimensions of field research and utility and validity of chosen methodologies. Remember the meaning of that word, validity. That's to say, have they chosen a methodology which is going to answer the question that they've asked? So if you are looking at the success of regeneration in Stratford, are you going to use traffic counts on a wet Thursday to try and answer the question that regeneration in the Isle of Dogs or Stratford or anywhere else has been a success? That's where validity goes all over the place, because clearly you haven't got valid data to be able to help you answer the question. If, however, you have got sediment data and you're looking at longshore drift and you're looking at beach profiles and a response of the physical beach environment to coastal management and longshore drift, then you've got valid data. So, and the utility just means how useful are they? How useful are the data in helping? But the validity is a bit tighter. It's, are you getting answers to the question you wanted on the basis of sound data? Fourth bullet point, synthesizes research findings to form rational conclusions. So their research findings, so the sum total of what they found out. The best way, and I think this student has done it, don't want to give it anything away, but the best analyses like this are where the student has set themselves 3 sub-questions, and that's how they organize the analysis. Sub-question 1, sub-question 2, sub-question 3, and they go to town on each one. So synthesizes research findings coherently to form rational conclusions. We used to call these ongoing evaluation in the days of A-level mark schemes, and the phrase is still used, I think, on one of the papers, ongoing evaluation. That's to say they get to the end of their analysis of their key question 1, and they provide you with a general conclusion. So you'll see that the student has done that in italics. And then synthesizes research findings, skipping over one, communicates conclusions that are supported by mostly relevant, there's a discriminator between level 3 or 4, mostly relevant fieldwork data or information presented in a manner which is appropriate and mostly technically accurate. Now, that's where we start to look at some of the detail on this. So let's just start to go through these. There's the breakdown then of the criteria, just in larger font. That's what we're going to look at first, these 2 bullet points. So the investigation shows use of appropriate geographical skills. You've got lots of, you can feast, if you like cross sections, if you like radar diagrams, bar charts, proportional circles. The proportional circles I thought were magnificent. Yeah, you've got those. You've got a Mann-Whitney U-test for the statistical analysis of data on page 39, and you've got an appraisal of the techniques used on pages 43 to 46 in the conclusion section. So again, you cross-refer. Now, maybe if you didn't get that far, you wouldn't take that into account, but nonetheless, that's the findings of the principal moderator. Then the next 2 criteria, synthesizes research findings coherently. So you've got evidence-based conclusions, and then convincing conclusions that are supported by the clear and technically accurate presentation of relevant fieldwork data and information. Now, let's go through these and see what principal moderator thinks. Student does try to synthesize their results. They link management to cliff condition on page 19. That's early on in their analysis. And the management and beach morphology on page 21. Now, here's the rub, because I think this is where the student has tripped up. And it's a trip which you could argue goes back to the time that the title was first designed, early on in the investigation, before the data were even collected. And it's important, I think, to look at the wording of this. The investigation could have been improved if the statistical test, so that's the Mann-Whitney, had been used to examine the impact that different management had had on cliff profile or beach morphology, instead of the differences in sediment size. And that's what the students got hung up on, the differences in sediment size, which might have been due to a variety of factors. Management might just have been one of the factors which led to those differences. And that's important, as the title of the work was not a comparison of the 2 areas, but an investigation to the impacts of management on those 2 areas. So there's a problem. It's almost as though when the student has been planning and thinking about their title and coming up with first draft ideas about data collection and so on. They might have had a lot of benefit from a discussion with the teachers who might have said, look, if you do that, you're going to get lots of data on sediment. Is that the answer that you want? Is that what is going to give you the answer to the impact of coastal management on cliff profile or beach morphology? Just leave the problem with the student. You can't do any more. It's their problem. But I think to highlight that, or to highlight with a class, just do 2 or 3 worked examples with the class of how a title might lead them into a particular, well, either a successful cul-de-sac or just a dead-end cul-de-sac. Some cul-de-sacs are really helpful because you get to the end of the investigation and you think, right, I found out something, great. Now let's go back to the main thrust. And you've done something. But sometimes students, I think this one has got themselves into a habit of just looking at all the stats data of, and it's not that it's not good analysis, it's really good analysis using techniques properly and so on, but it's not particularly appropriate for the title. And that, I think, is where this falls down. However, final bullet point is important. The strength of this section are the mini conclusions. Every sub-question, the 3 sub-questions have got their own mini conclusions. They're done in italics, is almost saying to the teacher marker and to the moderator, come on, this is what I found out. And they do that really well. So I think there are some real strengths of this. I think some of the data presentation is excellent. I think they've lost an opportunity to by not annotating their photographs. I think if you can hint to your students, just simply say, you know that Pearson Edexcel moderators love annotated photographs. So just tell your students that and let them pick up the baton if they can. So there's the overview. So level 3, 17 marks. It's a good bit of analysis. If the student had taken the question to its logical extent of thinking about how sediment and how coastal management that resulted from the sediment flow might have affected the cliff profile and cliff height and cliff angle and so on. If it had focused on cliffs, I think we'd have been talking about level 4. We might not have been high level 4, but we certainly, I think, given that the top of level 3 is 18, it wouldn't have been too much of a stretch for this one to push over into 19 or 20. So it's still not a disaster, but the section, because of that, is less strong than the others. And clearer details on cliff conditions at each location might have been useful. And that could have been done through the annotation of photographs. All that could have been addressed with the data that the students already got. There's some synthesis of the data that were collected and a stats test was used, but it would have been benefited from a link between the management of those locations and the beach characteristics. So I think that was where the student went wrong. It's a shame because this student has done a great deal of work. You can't take that away from the student at all. So let's just see any pointers that have come up in the chat box. Helen, what's the difference between ethical dimensions appearing here and in previous section? Pass. Difference between ethical dimensions appearing here and in previous section. While you're reading the next section, Helen, I'm going to look back at that so I can give you an answer to that. I can't give you an answer at the moment, but I will get back to you on that. Lisa, stats tests necessary? No, but they are desirable. If you've got data, analyze them. You see, I'd include a stats test as coding. If you've got qualitative interviews and statements, or if there are written secondary sources that the student wishes to analyze. I think stats tests are, I wouldn't say they're necessary, I think they're desirable. Where the data are available, I think they are well used. Anthony, good statistical reference on each of the data used, that's true, but no comparison made between the data. You're absolutely right. That's a good criterion where comparisons are made. I always think of the analysis as really being snowballing. You start off with, say, for instance, those photographs of cliffs, and you start with those, you annotate those, you analyze them, you draw conclusions, and then you go on to another bit of data, which adds to what you've already just found out about the cliffs. So you get this incremental snowballing effect of information. Okay, So let's do now the final section, part 4, and it's pages 27 to 35. And we've got, it's almost 25 past 5. So I'll come back to you at 25 to 6. And we'll look at where this goes. You have to bear in mind what we already know from the analysis and the presentation of information and the data that have been collected. So yeah, I think that's all I want to say at this stage. So I'll come back to you at 25 to 6, 17:35. Kat, in your question, did you mean in section 3 about the analysis or section 4, the conclusions? Actually, I'll answer the question. I think ideally to answer your question, both. I think that reference to literature or theories as appropriate, and that's always useful if students have done that. Yeah, I would say, I mean, for instance, if they found out, for instance, that coastal management has affected cliff profiling at the location they're investigating, they may have reference in a, I don't know, say a geofact sheet or something like that. It's about a stretch of coast where that hasn't happened. And in fact, management had unintended outcomes. So anywhere they can really is the answer, Kat, to your question. Yeah, Catherine, you're asking, do you have to show workings? No, you don't. If you were using Pearson's on Excel, I praise the students that use Pearson. It's so much better than Spearman's rank. No, you just use the Excel function. If they want a screenshot of the Excel spreadsheet to show how they've done it, that's absolutely fine. But they don't have to show all the workings, no. Right, Helen, just to answer your question about ethical dimensions, I think this is probably what you're getting at. So forgive me. Come back to me if you think I haven't answered the question. In the methodology section, it just says the student has looked at ethical dimensions and has considered those in the methods that they've used in, or that they propose to use in their data collection. When it gets to section 3 on the analysis, you're looking at ways in which perhaps ethical dimensions might have limited the research in some way, or have they acknowledged ethical dimensions in the way in which they present data. So for instance, if they were to use, say they've done some interviews and they want to use speech bubbles and quotes, have they anonymized all the people that are concerned as to who said what? So do they call it person A, person B, and there's no way of finding out anywhere else in the study who that person is, or about environmental considerations that they took into account of when they were collecting physical geography data, for instance. I don't know if that answers your question, but come back to me if you think I haven't answered it. Hi, Catherine. Yeah, it's a good question. Key thing you want to see in the analysis, you want to see the sub-questions and you want to see the sub-conclusions, i.e. each one has got a mini conclusion. As soon as you go to the main conclusion, you're going back to the main title. And you might argue perhaps the reason that you're asking the question is the student doesn't actually adopt that approach in their conclusion. They use their sub-questions again. Am I right in thinking that's why you've asked the question? Because it is a little bit confusing. Normally what you would expect is the student to return to the title question, which is different from doing it sub-question by sub-question as you do in the analysis. And the evaluation includes the evaluation of the conclusion, the strength of the conclusion. Have you got solid data that all point in one direction? Or are you a little bit wobbly? Some data support your question, whereas other data don't. Come back to me if I haven't answered that. Yes, that's right, Catherine. Yeah, main conclusion for the title in section 4. Mini conclusion in the analysis in section 3. Yeah. Okay, well, we're nearly 25 to 6. So if you're feeling confident enough to put your appropriate level that you think. Thank you, Jack. If you're being more specific, you're saying high level 3. Interesting point, Helen. Not enough synthesis. It's an important skill, isn't it, when we're looking at this? Jenny, you're perhaps up in borderline 3 to 4. Another bar wobbler. Martin, level 3 question mark. Does that mean you're low on it, Martin? Are you thinking level 3 low or level 3 high? Anyway, let's thank you, Sean. Yes, Kelly, lacking the link to comparative example. Yeah, agreed with all of that. Yeah. Right, I'll just close the chat box down. Let's look at these. Okay, it's the thing that makes this different from section 3 as the mark scheme is we're back to AO1, AO2, AO3. Now, if you look at the bullet points, 4 of the 6 are AO3, so it is predominantly skills that we're looking at. But you do want to see a return to that mostly accurate and relevant geographical knowledge and understanding of location. And it's kind of beginning and end. It's you're at the end of the investigation in your conclusion. So to what extent are you using accurate and relevant geographical knowledge in understanding the location? Has your study worked out, basically? Is the location that you've chosen an appropriate one that's enabled you to get the results that you got that have really helped in answering your question? Has it worked against you, for instance, getting accurate information? There's an evaluation of which we'll come to in a minute. But that geographical theory, you really do want to see the students return to their secondary information, their background information, the process information that they used in the first section to say, right, how have I enhanced that? What's changed as a result of my investigation? And then second bullet point, applying that understanding to find, now notice here's another discriminator, largely coherent and relevant links between the investigation conclusions and broader geographical context. So is what you found significant geographically? What have you found out that is relevant? What is it about the conclusions that link to perhaps things that you started off hoping to find out, or things that other people said happened in other places, and have you found it happening in this place? Then there's that word in the third bullet point, synthesizing most aspects of research finding in a largely coherent manner. So there's another discriminator. If you look at level 4, in a coherent manner is level 4. Then fourth bullet point, a mainly appropriate appraisal of the reliability of evidence. Mainly appropriate. There's another discriminator between that and level 4, of the reliability of evidence and validity of conclusions. Just to make it clear, reliability of evidence, has it been collected in a way which takes account of reliability? If you went out and showed somebody else how to do that, could they do it? We sometimes call that repeatable data. If you could follow the instructions and carry out your own investigation and you got reliable data that way, that would mean that the student has really used reliable findings. Validity of conclusions, are they valid anytime, any day? Could you go back to, sorry to use the old example again, but Guildford High Street on a Thursday afternoon in summer compared to a Saturday morning in winter, or vice versa, and would you get the same sorts of findings? Now, it may well be that you're questioning that and maybe you get different findings. So there's nothing wrong with acknowledging it. It's just simply saying that in order to make my data more valid, I would need to do X, Y, Z. Then fifth point, a developed argument that considers a relevant selection of factors in an uneven manner. It's that answer that says, well, you've thought about this a lot. You quickly skipped over 2 or 3 other points. And that, again, is a discriminator between that and level 4. In an uneven manner, I think the level 4 word is either coherent manner or consistent manner, which is expressed through logical lines of reasoning that are clear. Here's another discriminator, but not fully developed, and demonstrates a use of an appropriately structured inquiry process. Basically, the student has done everything they can. A bit like this one, you can see where the inquiry has gone. You can see what conclusions the student has come to in terms of the key conclusions. We're not really let into the conclusions about the general title. But that's where this student probably comes down. And some of you are thinking that you were going to award this level 3. That might have been one of your main ideas, that you were lacking that overview, even though the student's evaluation is pretty good. It just lacked that overview. And then finally, Final bullet point, conclusions mostly supported by drawing together a selection of mostly relevant evidence. So are they just going with the bits that helped to confirm what it was they hoped they'd find out? Or have they used all the data to say, well, look, I did find this out and it showed that my idea was right in some ways, but there are other ways in which I've got a few doubts. So there's the general statement. Here they are. We'll break them down a little bit and get some feedback from the principal moderator. So we're going to look first of all at AO1, the relevant knowledge and location. AO2 applies understanding to get links between the conclusions and broader geography. Is there broader geography out there as a basic that will fit with what I found out in my locality? And then synthesizing most aspects of research findings. Well, general conclusion is this. There's some relevant geographical knowledge. You've got the link between erosion and cliff profile on page 41 and the impact of groins also on page 41. No comparative context. That's missing this time. And that's, if you want to claim that you found out something significant, you really want to say, and it's also going on in this other place, or you want to refer back to the other place in some way, even if it was somewhere that you haven't been to, you haven't studied, but you came across it in, say, an Environment Agency report or something like that. How the study might have been improved if impacts of coastal management have been compared to another coastal area experiencing rapid coastal retreat, such as the Holderness Coast. So there's a clear pointer that's in the marker's mind with how this might have been improved. There is some geographical knowledge, fourth bullet point, about the location shown. There's some reference to geology and geological history. That's quite a rare thing, actually. If you read the examiner's report for paper 1 this year, geology is a real, geological knowledge is a real weakness across the A-level cohort. So it's good to see that there's some accurate geology and geological history here, especially the creation of the undercliff at the end of the last ice age. There's an attempt at synthesis, but as with the preceding section, it would have been improved if the links were made between cliff condition and beach characteristics and management of each side. That in the end is where the study falls down slightly. It's just a shame. Had the student not gone in quite such detail into the links about the stats regarding sediment in section 3, they might have had something to say about that in section 4. But anyway, remaining 3 criteria: convincing conclusions, a balanced appraisal of reliability of evidence and validity of conclusions, and then the concise, well-developed argument and logical lines of reasoning. Well, there's an appraisal of the reliability of each type of data collection, pages 43 to 46. The evaluation is pretty good, actually. Could have been improved with specific links to the effects the limitations had on the validity of the conclusions drawn. And again, just even going back to revisiting that title and thinking, did I get that right in spending so much time looking at sediment? Didn't really think about that. And there are sound conclusions in the preceding section, but it would have been improved if an overall conclusion has been. Catering, that's really what you were talking about, isn't it? If an overall conclusion had been made linking the management to the cliff condition and beach characteristics. Okay, so there you are. Level 3, 17 marks. If you said, upper level 3 to 4, you're very much on the right lines. Think about it. It is about accuracy. But if, as your moderator, I'm giving this 17 and you've given it 18, nobody died. That's not a problem. Your marks will be upheld, and we could have a difference in, say, 2 marks or something like that. With one study and 2 marks at the other way in another study. Broadly speaking, as moderator, I'm looking at your work and they've generally got it right. And the usual thing is, have you got the level right? That's the important thing to get right. And that's why we make a big thing about levels in this presentation, in this exercise this afternoon. So there are sound conclusions in the last 2 sections. Excuse me. There's a clear appraisal of the reliability and validity of the conclusions, but no comparative context. So giving a best fit, there are lots of places where the student does meet the criteria for level 3, but 17 we feel is about right. And that means to say that the overall marks for this come out at 52 out of 70. And because I know you'll ask this question, I'm sure you're probably getting ready to type it now. Under the component, these are component notional grade boundaries. These are the grade boundaries all examiners of each unit So Unit 1 exam, Unit 2 exam, and so on. Each exam has its own profile of component grades. It's not like the old unitized exams that used to be the way back before 2016. These are notional grades that look at the distribution of marks across the whole cohort for each particular component. So in this case, the NEA. And last year, the examiners decided that A star was 60, A was 55, B was 48. So with 52, this comes out at a very safe B. And if you were looking at this and thinking, yeah, if I were to give this an A, I could see 2 or 3 ways in which this one could easily be lifted to an A, then that's the point. Okay, let me just take a quick look at the chat questions, if there's anything that's come up there, and then we'll move on to some frequently asked questions just to finish this off. Your gut feeling, Martin, level 3 high. So thanks for that. Those of you who said, you know, you put level 3 question mark, that was really helpful. Thank you for all the interaction on the chat this afternoon as well. Catherine, does comparative context, does that mean the student would state the extent to which their findings could be relevant to another location? Absolutely. Yep. Or what goes on is different to what happened in place X or place Y, and there are reasons for that. They can perhaps begin to suggest 1 or 2 reasons for that. Yeah, you have that spot on. Again, those of you who've put in the chat this afternoon, thanks for your contributions. It's really helpful. Okay, frequently asked questions. So these are some of them that I'll just finish with. It is now 17:46, so I've got about probably 5 to 8 minutes just on this before we finish at about 5:02. You can post questions as well in the group chat if you want to. These are the ones that come up quite quickly. So I'll deal with 3 first of all. What counted as primary data in 2023? Excuse me. Can my students use data gathered by students in previous years as primary data? And how many data collection methods, it's come up already this afternoon, hasn't it? Do my students need to include to access the top level in the mark scheme? Here we go. Let's deal with those 3 questions. First of all, primary data have got to form part of every investigation. That's the key thing. An investigation purely on secondary data has never been allowed for past cohorts and wouldn't be considered appropriate this last year, or 2024. Sorry, tickly throat, just having a drink. But it is acceptable for primary data to be collected without going into the field. It can be done virtually. So lots of students do questionnaires. In fact, the students who do questionnaires using Microsoft or Google Forms do it electronically, often get the most fantastic sample sizes. Came across one last year where somebody had the thoughts of regeneration of their own age cohort. They put a questionnaire around the 6th form and asked people to fill it out, and what young people of 6th form age thought about regeneration in place X. Really good data sample. Had a data sample of across the whole year, which I think was about 120 or something like that, and got very, very good responses. So you can get virtual data, online surveys, Google Street View, webcams, things like that, but you must have primary data. That's the important thing. Whether you're using social media platforms to engage with an audience, whatever, you don't have to go out. The field these days means something quite different. Second one, selective use of various methods about digital methods is good practice. You can widen the range of data collected. You can use satellite imagery, which has been used in this last investigation that we looked at this afternoon. Online surveys can widen the range of participants. There are limitations, but sometimes, you know, there are limitations to standing out in Stratford High Street on a cold February day. And Google Street View can help provide a comparative context with a place a student couldn't otherwise visit easily, or maybe if Google Street View is a bit slow in catching up, so maybe new building has gone on, but Google Street View shows old buildings still in place, so students have got a direct chance to make comparisons. There've got to be an element of first-hand primary data in the field, and it can be a questionnaire or telephone interview can be email dialogue with a planner or something like that, or local counsellor, candidates' own photographs, that kind of thing. So the first-hand primary data is really quite broad in its definition, but students must use it. And this fieldwork section uses these words: chooses appropriate methods to collect a range of data and information relevant to the geographical topic. And so therefore some of that must be primary. Now, second question, primary data collected by other students is secondary data. So there's no number of and the third question about number of primary techniques, there is no set number. Sufficient data must be collected for the student to be able to conduct a valid analysis and draw conclusions. And sometimes that involves a blend of primary and secondary information. So it's whatever it takes. Now, that doesn't mean to say the student has to go out and do 200 questionnaires or anything like that. But equally, if they're trying to compare inequality in a small town, by doing 2 EQS in one housing estate and 2 EQS in another point in another housing estate at the other end of town, it's not going to be enough. So it's often the number of examples that they get within that particular technique. It's not the number of techniques, it's the way in which they use the technique to collect together a valid sample. So I hope that answers the question. The student must be able to put themselves in a situation where they can analyze data and draw conclusions. You know, I have seen graphs in the past which have been based on the findings of 3 questionnaires, and it's just sad. You know, the student is not going to do well on that. And it can be qualitative or quantitative data. It doesn't have to be numerical. Grade boundaries, very briefly, do we expect grade boundaries in 2024 to remain similar? So those figures I gave you for the comparative grade boundaries for this unit last June, 60 for an A star, 55 for an A, 48 for a B. It'll be about the same. They were very, very similar to 2019, which was the benchmark for this year, and there's not expected to be any substantial change for 2024. I think we had one year, I think 2018 might have been 62 for an A star, I think, if my memory goes back. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was. So it does vary slightly, but the proportions are pretty much the same, and 60 is about right for an A star. Then a few frequently asked questions about titles in the proposal form, just before we finish. My student, now this one, it may apply to many of you. My student titles are all quite similar. Will the moderator penalize you for this? Moderator will not penalize the centre. It's the centre's responsibility, however, I must say this, to ensure there's no plagiarism. And I have to say, must be the sort of, well, a centre that I have come across in the past. In a previous year, the student that, well, I think the teacher had probably found 10 collectible pieces of articles or information, made those available to the students, and all the students used all 10. So there's no evidence of individuality anywhere. That's the problem. It's as much a problem for that as there is to plagiarism. Let your students do the research. In large centres, if you're teaching in centres where there's maybe, 80, 90, 120, 200 A-level students, some of your titles are going to be similar. That said, I moderated one sixth form centre last year. Absolutely magnificent. Every single title. I looked at, they sent nearly all 200 of them. They were all different. Absolutely amazing. You don't have to do that. Don't worry about that. But, if titles look quite similar, just make sure that the student work and the students are aware of the other people doing the similar kind of work, and that they just make them all look different. Difference is key. The moderator looks for difference. And only if there's concerns over plagiarism will similarity of title be an issue. Okay. Differentiation between students becomes apparent if you have got students with similar titles. Selection of the range of sources. This is the sort of thing that I look at as a moderator. This is what I'm told to do by Pearson Edexcel. I need to look at the selection of a range of sources. So 10 secondary sources, 10 articles or reports, all used by all the students. Doesn't cut it. So it's got to be a selection process. Comparative content and broader geographical considerations in the introduction. So Comparative examples might be very different. The use and selection of secondary data can be different, and the quality of analysis, the tools used to analyze. Synthesis, evaluation, and conclusions in the try and find loose sections, again, also ought to be quite clearly differentiated. So I hope that answers the questions. My candidates want to do investigations based on carbon or water topics. Do you recommend it? They can do, certainly, of course they can. Motivated students can read ahead. If they're doing A-level biology, they'll already have a good understanding of some of the concepts in the carbon cycle anyway. And they can consider a range of possible studies. So transect across a range of locations, such as woodland. Had a lovely title 2 years ago from a student who looked at the value of a particular park ecologically to a town centre. It was a park that was just outside a town centre. And it was a very good analysis of the value of that park in carbon terms as well as in human terms. Very good indeed. So yes, you can do those, of course. Water topics could be based on sustainable water systems in section 5.9b. There's other kinds of ideas there from the GA about the teaching resources and flooding and sustainable drainage that you can have a look at. Suitable primary data you've got to collect, so it couldn't just be a survey of sustainable drainage system. The student would need to come up with some primary data, but that need not be a difficult ask. Changes in function. I'm a new teacher. Some of my students want to study questions about changes in function in Greenwich. Would these investigation questions work? To what extent has the function of Greenwich changed over time? How has local and national planning affected Greenwich? Well, you might look at those and think, oh, I'm not sure about those. No. So the first one, to what extent have changes in Greenwich function made for a more sustainable community? You could tie it into the egg and wheel, so it's linked to the spec that way. Function's a wide-ranging concept, especially change over time, could be included. I would say this. I think if you're going to do something about change, the students got to have access to data that reflect change. Got to have a really good photograph selection, images, something that enables to give the student a sense of before and after. If they just look at the now and try and hypothesize about the past, they'll dig themselves into a bit of a hole. How has local and national planning affected Greenwich? Second one, it could become so massive. Greenwich is a London borough. The average population of a London borough is round about 250,000 to 300,000. So it could be so massive. The candidates decide to focus on a small area. Small is beautiful when it comes to size of study areas. Fits with the spec, certainly, but it needs to explore perhaps issues such as house building in a particular locality or something like that. Where can you get further support? You may know this young man. He's been with us for certainly part of this afternoon. Hello, John. Nice to have you along. John leads the geography team in terms of being the subject officer, the subject advisor, and he'll give you information if you sign up about qualification updates, support, training and resources, and any other help you may wish for. Fieldwork investigation, there's a number of different publications about fieldwork investigations from Pearson. So they're all there, including non-examined NEA exemplar packs and the Maths for Geographers Guide, which we shouldn't underwrite for many students for whom maths is not their first language. And then finally, assessment services, where you may get previous exam questions. You can build your own exam papers using Exam Wizard, and analysis of the past scores, exam scores for your students using Results Plus, along with access to scripts. That last bit was a bit of a rush. Sorry about that. We're 2 minutes to go, so I'm going to get cut short in a minute because the recording will just end. So I'll say thank you to you all very much for being along this afternoon. Hope it's proved useful. Hope that I've given some of the discriminators between level 3 and 4, because they are difficult, some of those, and you want some exemplars to help you out. So hopefully you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you on the circuit in future months and terms. Thanks, everybody. Good luck.